Okay, it looks like we got a lot of people in. So welcome everyone to say bye-bye to burnout at work. My name is Max Green. I'm a recent alumni of the University of Oregon, currently working at Intel in Finance and Strategy. I'm part of the UO PDX chapter, which is the UO alumni chapter located in Portland. The Portland Ducks chapter has partnered with the UOAA with a vision of building on a series of skill sharing workshops that features alumni, and I'm excited we're kicking off our first one today. I feel fortunate that we have a special guest here, and I want to introduce Grant. A little background about Grant. He received a degree in public relations from the UO and is currently a senior growth marketing manager with Qualtrics. A 10-year veteran in the tech industry, Grant is passionate about eliminating burnout from work. He is the author of not one, but two newsletters, Sustain and How I Quit Burnout, which can be found along his blog series at grantgurewitz.com. Grant also serves on the UO Alumni Association Board of Directors, and we'll set aside time at the end of the presentation so audience can bring some questions. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now I want to hand it off to Grant to begin.
Thanks so much, Max. I appreciate the very kind intro, and hi everyone. It's great to be with you all today. So as Max said, I'll kind of give a quick presentation for 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to some scripted Q&A that Max has and to all of your audience Q&A. But as in the intro, burnout is something that's very near and dear and personal to me. It's something I kind of got deep into years ago, figured out a path out of it, and excited to share that with you here today. And through my work, kind of both personally and within my full-time job, I do a lot of work within our company at Qualtrics, really trying to think about how do we, at a systematic level, really think about eliminating burnout from work, since, as I'm sure you all feel, and probably why you're joining today, it's such a pervasive and kind of hard to pin down issue also. So excited to get into all of that here today. But as I kind of mentioned here, so I really view burnout as basically having three different parties involved with it at work. There's the organizational component. So what can organizations be doing to really combat burnout? What can managers and leaders be doing? And then what can individuals be doing? Since I think there's a lot of power that we as individual employees can play as well. So we'll get into, I think, more of what organizations and managers and leaders can be doing in the Q&A. A lot of the work I focus on personally, and what I'll share in the next few minutes here, is really kind of my playbook and what I've developed through research and trial and error over the years for really what individuals, what you yourself can be doing to play defense against burnout at work, but also still kind of find that success that you're looking for within your job, and what I've learned over the years. So I'll start into my story and kind of how I got into burnout, and then kind of we'll get into kind of what I call my 4-step playbook for quitting burnout at work. So as I came out of school, I graduated in 2013, so I'm 10 years into my career now. But in my early years, like I subscribed to what some people call hustle culture, so this idea where you need to be working a lot to really show your worth. And certainly that can be really impactful and helpful at the beginning of your career in some ways. But it got to the point so much for me that I was working the 60 hours a week, and I was just really to the point where I was overworking myself, and like just not in a way that I could truly be productive in how I wanted to do things anymore. I was spending a lot of time focused on reading industry blogs and listening to podcasts, and always trying to chase this like shiny thing, and spending a lot of extra time to do it, to kind of prove my worth early on in my career. And I spent a lot of time ultimately chasing, I think, a lot of the wrong things that got me to a point where, yeah, I just fried, frankly. So once I got to that point where I was like, okay, I'm just like overworked. I've worked myself to the bone here. I started to figure out like, hey, how can I get out of this burnout myself? So I turned to like what I knew, which was a lot of blogs and kind of self-help, either books or podcasts or materials out there, and basically tried to create this pretty intense like network of, let's call them life hacks, to treat myself well. So I was maybe waking up at 5 a.m. to journal and do push-ups or do all these different things in the morning, like I read somewhere. And then I was trying to do this like lunchtime routine, and I was trying to work out, even though like my body was just telling me I was so like over the hill of being exhausted. So I think like I had a phase one of burnout really from like just deep overwork. And then I had this second kind of wave of burnout from like this really manic network of essentially life hacks that I put together for myself. And I kind of had this moment in my head crystallize where I realized like what you do inside of work and outside of work are so interconnected. And I mean, it sounds kind of obvious to say it when I do say it just there, but I think for a lot of times, like we think of work as such an independent, isolated area, and burnout only stems from work. But realistically, like everything we do and how we spend our time really end up impacting how we might experience or think about burnout. So once that like I got to that point where I driven myself even deeper really into this hole of like overworking myself and like trying to have this really unsustainable like system of kind of lifestyle hacks that I'd put together for myself. I got to this point where like for almost 9 months probably in my job, I like would walk in every day and like barely have enough energy to basically send out an email or two every single day. So it just got to that point where I didn't have the mental wherewithal or energy or stamina to really perform in my job at all the way I knew I wanted to and the way I knew I was capable of. So it was at that point where I started to run across some different work around um, like a book called like The Blue Zones, if you've heard about that, which is basically this work and study and research on the longest lived pockets and cultures of people in the world. And it's really interesting research in terms of like what are like the characteristics that these people do on a daily basis. They have a sense of community, they have a sense of purpose. They're moving their body, but they're not necessarily like doing these crazy workout routines like some Instagram influencer you follow may have you believe that you need to do, for example. So I spent a lot of time really reflecting on what that meant for me and thinking about how I could kind of weave that into my life. Along with coming along that research, I also started to have this like realization in my head that while we talk about a lot probably as a society about like climbing the corporate ladder and getting to be maybe a vice president or a CEO or kind of the head of the company someday, I think it's important to realize that that's not the right path and maybe isn't the right goal for everyone. So I definitely got to that point for myself where like, yes, I want to continue to find success. I want to be able to get promoted and like have good career trajectory. But I also didn't feel like I needed to work like 60 to 80 hours a week to chase down like a goal of becoming like a chief marketing officer at my company, which was in like the department that I work in. So I think like that was another important realization for me. So once I got to that point of like understanding that with myself, I worked to really like figure out like what does that mean? Like what does that mean for my actions, for how I spend my time, for what I focus on at work? And so I really spent the next 2 years trialing and erroring a bunch of different things. And eventually, like what I work to is this 4-step playbook that I'll walk you through, at least at a high level here right now. So the way I think about like how I kind of keep away and resist burnout for myself at work, and I've been using this effectively for 2 years. And as Max mentioned in the intro, write a newsletter to hundreds of people every week and kind of share out some of the learnings here. But so the 4 chapters are what I call downsizing your relationship with work is number 1. Making work is chapter 2. Building your boundaries is chapter 3. And then unprogramming your well-being is chapter 4. I'll give you an example from each one of those. So the first of downsizing your relationship with work is actually a term that I saw utilized by Cal Newport, who wrote the book Deep Work, which I think is actually kind of like a new realization and epiphany that a lot of people have had in the last couple of years with COVID and so many other world events happening, where I think like a lot of people have come to this collective understanding and realization that priorities are kind of shifting in our lives right now, like where pre-COVID, like work for a lot of people used to be like the thing. That was your identity. That's where you spent a lot of your time. But we've started to kind of like understand that, hey, there may actually be some other high impact and high important aspects of our life that we want to be able to take the time to explore and make time for. So the first kind of step that I really suggest in this area is really to take some time and reflect and define how you like define success. I think for a lot of people, like we've been made to believe for whatever reason that money and power, I think, are two areas that, like in a very pretty traditional American sense, distinguish like how we should think about success. And not to say that those things aren't important, but I started to recalibrate in my mind a little bit what success looked like for me, and really thinking of it more around the idea of having a lot of control or agency over my time was really how I wanted to define success for myself. So with that slight like kind of mindset shift, like that really helped me to figure out like, okay, how do I like line up the actions that I'm doing, how I spend my time in a way that allow me to have the most time and control over my time possible versus always chasing like the next title or chasing a bonus or something like that. So that was an important step for me. And then the other place in this downsizing your relationship with work chapter that I call here is really coming to terms with the fact that like rest isn't lazy. And I think it's not lazy, it's not unproductive. It's something that rest for whatever reason has kind of been demonized by a lot of people. And like, yes, it can be hard to pull away from work sometimes, but there's this saying in French that I absolutely love, and it loosely translates to this idea of you have to withdraw in order to make a better jump. And I think like that idea is like such a powerful way of thinking, where like you really have to give yourself time on a daily basis and then some more extended time on a fairly regular basis to be able to go far in what you're doing. Since work and our careers it's a long game. So like we can't be always running a sprint. We can't be the hare in the race. Like we've got to think about how we exhibit some more kind of like tortoise-like behaviors sometimes. So that's chapter one, downsizing your relationship with work. Chapter two is this idea of making work work. So this is really like once you get inside your workday, like what are some things you can be doing? The first step that I always suggest in this area here is using your goals really effectively as a way to essentially play defense in some ways. So I think pretty much all of us within our professional settings, whether it's on a yearly basis, a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, work with your boss to define goals and like how your success is going to be measured at work. So it's really, really important to take time to do that well, make sure your goals are something that feels realistic and that you can actually take on in a normal work day and setting, and then revisit those all the time, since as I'm sure happens in your capacities all the time, you may set out for the quarter with one idea of what things look like, and then new projects fly in and whatnot. So it's really, really important to always revisit those goals and to go back and say, okay, if we are going to take on this new priority that's coming out of left field, what's going to drop off? Because we can't operate in a world necessarily like where we have an infinite number of slots. Like we have to keep like a very finite number of slots in what we do and kind of what goes into that. So really using those goals as a way to manage up to your leadership to make sure that you're taking on only what you can. Chapter three is this idea of building your boundaries. So this is, I think, come to be a really, really important one, especially as we've shifted for a lot of people into remote or hybrid work where we're at home. And right now I'm 2 steps away from my couch and something that I could watch on TV and would be a lot more interesting maybe some days than my job. So I think where this becomes really important, where the continuum between work and life is really kind of just coalesced into one, is creating a really strong end of day ritual. This idea that like, hey, I'm going to leave my computer usually around 4:30, maybe 5, to go maybe exercise, move my body somehow, cook dinner, do something that like signals to my brain like, in space of where maybe I would be commuting in the past. Like my work day is done and I've closed my laptop and I'm done for the day and I'm not going to log in until tomorrow. And then the last chapter is this idea of unprogramming your well-being. And what I mean by that is actually kind of going back to what I've been kind of touching on a little bit throughout my talk here, which is this idea that like so much of like our lifestyle and like what you see on podcasts and Instagram and like all these different places like can be really beneficial, but a lot of like these extreme like healthy habits can be hard to follow like day after day, month after month, and they become a little unsustainable and can almost work against you in some ways where you kind of feel like you're failing because you can't like maintain like eating like this crazy diet or working out in this crazy workout routine that you've set up for yourself every single day. So what I really try and focus on is just getting back to basics. And actually early in the pandemic, I shared out this system that I call 3 good pockets that has helped a lot of people, and I've heard some great feedback on, which is basically this idea of create like a huge pick list of like all the activities that bring you happiness or joy or let you just kind of exhale. So for me, that might be kayaking, going on a walk, vegetable gardening, which I'm doing a lot right now as spring comes back into play here. Those activities that just allow you to be you and find some happiness in there. So you have this list, and then the idea in 3 good pockets is that you basically ask yourself every day, like, where can I find 3 good pockets, 3 little pockets of time to, even if it's just read for 5 minutes or go on a walk around the block. Like, it doesn't have to be extreme or extravagant, but this idea that like you're dedicating just like 3 little moments of time throughout your day to prioritize you really goes a long way and can build kind of a nice snowball effect down the road. So that's my story. That's my playbook. As I said, I'm very passionate about this topic since it's not always approached the right way, in my opinion, in terms of like what you might read and see out there. So I love venues like this, and I appreciate the UOAA and Max and working this program, so we get an opportunity to discuss and kind of really talk about what everyone can do in a burnout capacity. So I'll let Max come back on board here, and we can shift into the Q&A section here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grant. And also, while we're going through this Q&A section, feel free to put some more questions in the chat box, and we'll get to that at the end. I had some, follow-up questions for me, and, for me personally, in my early career, I struggled to bring up work-life balance conversations with my manager because, you want to come in, you want to prove yourself, you want to do a really great job. And I was afraid of coming off as a slacker or lazy, which is, I think a lot of people have that issue. Do you have any tips how do you approach that conversation with your manager over the course of your career? And also the reality that not all managers are going to be okay with this, and not all companies are going to be okay with this, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think so. It's a great question. And I think so much has changed in the last, not even 2 years, but really in the last 6 to 9 months as we've entered into this great resignation or great fill in the blank period that we've seen a lot, where I think employees have such a newfound power in a lot of ways that they haven't in a long time. Like every company is dealing with retention and attrition issues right now. So I think there's a really, really important factor in play to understand the headwinds and the forces in play in the market here right now. So, and really the way I have always approached this conversation is what I mentioned about the goals, and using your goals as a way to I have a weekly one-on-one with my manager every week, and we kind of revisit, okay, here's what I'm working on essentially, and be able to have those trade-off conversations or figure out how we make sure we stay on the same page. So that's the important kind of foundation setting. If you need to bubble it up to more of the macro level conversation, to me, it's always more of the I want to stay here at this company. I want to be successful in the long run, but I just cannot maintain this level and expect to perform. And ultimately, my quality of work is going to diminish the more we are basically running a sprint every single day for weeks and then months and then years on end. Like it's just like you can't sustain working in that sort of capacity. And actually, there's some interesting research that came out recently in this idea that managers and employees have sometimes a slightly different perception, where managers are actually sometimes a little more willing to give on the timeline. So they're willing to give a little more space on the timeline in favor of having high quality work. Whereas employees sometimes feel like it can be hard to have that conversation, understandably so. But that understanding that at the end of the day, like high quality, I think is going to win out at the end of the day. So if you're like, this timeline for this project is just like not something like I can achieve, like understanding that like, hey, if you like talk through, like if we can get another week or two on this project, here's like what we're going to be able to produce versus trying to cram it in 3 days and me having to work, I don't know, 10-hour days to do it for that amount of time. So hopefully that's helpful. But that's usually the way I approach those conversations.
No, I think that's really smart. I mean, it's coming from the perspective of we all want to do great work, and I can't do the best work for you and the team if I'm just getting burnt out. So I think that's a great way to place it. Another follow up with the presentation is coming from the employee's perspective. I'd love to kind of flip it because I wonder if there's people in the audience that are managers or a little further in their career. How can managers recognize when their employees are getting burned out, and also actually start that conversation if the employee can't feels uncomfortable starting from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, managers know their employees probably better than anyone. So like if you are starting to see just like a drop off probably in quality of work or the just like how engaged that person might be, like those are usually some kind of early signs to be looking for. As far as like from a proactive standpoint, like what managers can be doing, I think basically flipping what we just said the other way is like really being systematic about prioritization, since like for a long time we've tried to exist in a world where everything is a top priority, and there's really no sense of like things that get like dropped below the cut line. But I think, and like actually our company is in the process of doing this right now. Like our marketing leadership team, for example, is every single week they're saying like, okay, these are our top priorities for the week. If like you're not working on one of these, or if you're doing projects or work that doesn't like ladder up to one of those priorities, like let's have a conversation between employee and manager and figure out how do we make sure people are kind of steered in the right direction. So I think there's a lot of that like protection kind of shielding element of like, how do managers and leaders really make sure that employees are focused on the right things that allows them to feel connected and aligned and like actually making an impact on the business. And so you as an employee don't want to be out there just doing something and you're like, what's the point of this? Like this isn't actually helping or doing or moving the business forward. Like I want to feel like I'm participating and contributing to the business in a meaningful way.
No, that's a great point. It's basically focusing on the meat and potatoes, what's going to actually move the business forward. And for me personally, I'm lucky to have a manager that has that and understands that and avoids the weekend work. But it is from that focus from the start. And then a couple more of kind of the questions that we want to talk about is, for me personally, I don't know, for early in your career, how you even recognize that you are burnt out. Like, what are the signs and stuff? I think for me coming out of school, I was working super late at night. So if I'm working super late at night work, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal. So what are those like signs that you notice that you're like, oh, this is an issue. Okay, I'm really not feeling like Grant anymore. And you're like, okay, yeah. I am burnout. I need to stop this.
It's interesting. I actually probably didn't even name it burnout or like recognize it like in the moment. It probably took me a few years afterwards of like really like kind of looking back on it and being like, oh yeah, I think this lines up as burnout essentially. But for real, like I tend to be a pretty high performer and like focusing and doing like great work. And like obviously when I get to a point where I'm spending almost 9 months like with barely any like energy to send an email or two every single day, like that probably not a great sign there. So I think just like having enough like self-understanding of like your habits and yourself, it will carry you farther. But I agree, like when like I came out of school in my first couple years in my career, like I'd been used to doing school and having an internship or two, and kind of like doing a lot of things at all hours of the day. So it definitely does take probably a couple of years to kind of, I don't know, just like get your legs under you, like in a professional sense, like after graduating, to really feel like you have an understanding of yourself and kind of like the rhythms that you like to go in.
That's a great point. It just takes time, after a period of time. And, I definitely had it the first 6 months of working, and I'm glad that I had managers and people around me that were like, "You're not acting like you, Max." So we got to back up a little bit.
And I mean, honestly, it gets a lot into, and I don't know if we'll get to this question, but this idea back to like what organizations and even leaders can be doing at some level is, I think we've entered into this state where like organizations are finally understanding like the importance of well-being and kind of like these connected conversations in the workplace. So we've seen a lot of organizations in the last couple of years roll out maybe rest and recharge days, or like a gym stipend, or some like wellness benefits. And to me, like, I'm not going to say no to these things. I think they're a nice step, but to me, they're kind of a band-aid on top of the problem for burnout. Like if you take a rest and recharge day, that's great. I have Monday off and the whole company has Monday off. But if I go back into the office on Tuesday and like I'm expected to pick up and keep working like crazy and run around the hamster wheel, like that one day off at the end of the day probably doesn't do a whole lot. So where like I really encourage, and actually a lot of my work that I do at Qualtrics is well focused on the overall employee experience and how we can think about this, is how do you really systematically create a culture of well-being? And it's not nearly as simple. Like that's a very, very difficult long-term question and like actions to solve for. So it's not as simple as just giving people a day off or just rolling out like a gym stipend monthly benefit or something like that. But really thinking about like if attrition is an issue, like how do we create the cultural norms that make it okay for people to go on a walk in the middle of the day? Or Patagonia has this long-term like amazing just kind of workplace understanding where it's called like let my people go surfing. So if it's a beautiful day in Southern California, which I guess it is a lot of times, like their employees are welcome to go catch some great surf that afternoon, even if it's a Wednesday afternoon, because you can't let a good surf go by. So things like that just like allow employees on their time to be flexible, still do the work, but do it more on their schedule and their time, is I think where we kind of have to go in the future and really approach well-being at the organizational level, at the cultural level, and not just like throw some benefits at employees and ask them still to kind of self-manage it themselves. Like this has to be, as I said, the kind of three-pronged organization, managers and individuals, to help really create really positive outcomes here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, it's a fight for talent out there. And these are the things that employees, are thinking about in the back of their mind. At least that's what I think about, day in, day out. I want to go take a break and look at some audience questions as well. And we can go back to some other scripted Q&A. But also in the audience, if you have any other questions for Grant, please send them through. So we have one. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts around vacations that would help mitigate burnout?
Yeah, well, I think the first one is take them, which can sometimes be hard. And then the second one off of that is to, when you take time off, is to actually take your time off. And I know that maybe sounds a little redundant, but I think, as I said, like this idea of like you have to withdraw in order to take a better jump, like re-normalizing this behavior of actually taking time off and vacations, and not just like a long weekend or something like that, but like wherever you possibly can, like even if it means you're going to come back to a pile of email when you come back, like take that at least yearly time to take more of like an extended time off if you possibly can. So I know like when I take my trips, like of course, like there's a lot of legwork that you want to do ahead of time and like make sure people have enough notice and like you're able to leave projects in a good place and all of that. But at the end of the day, like both you personally and your outcomes that you provide to the business are going to be in better shape when you do take your time off and your vacation, and doing so in a way that is relaxing to you. So that's on the vacation front. But even like if we look at like day to day, like I think it's really important, like when we think about just our daily kind of rest and rejuvenation period, like, sure, I sit on the couch most nights and watch TV or something like that. But I do also take time to like make sure I'm giving myself like at least probably 2 hours before bed. Like I usually put my phone away. I'm not scrolling through social media to, I don't know, kind of keep my brain spinning on a bunch of things. I'm not looking at work to kind of keep my brain in a work sense a couple hours before bed. So I do have that time to like really unwind and like make sure I'm getting good sleep and taking care of myself.
No, those are really good tips. And I think there's also a conversation too. I kind of want to back up in the current reality where COVID and how that's
Mhm.
affected work-life balance opposed to the regular. I mean, for me personally, I've only worked in a COVID environment, so that's all I know. But can you talk about how COVID has kind of affected burnout and around well-being as well? Just a little background on that.
Yeah, well, so I think, I mean, for the last couple decades, I think we've been moving fairly quickly to this like kind of always on work environment, right? Like with the advent of cell phones, and you can have your messaging apps, you can have your email in your pocket, and like we've kind of created this always on environment that, I mean, has been building, as I said, for the last couple decades here. But I think what COVID, as I mentioned, like this idea of the Great Resignation, and actually the professor at Texas A&M who coined the Great Resignation term, really like talked about like the ideas of burnout has really fueled this. And then this pandemic epiphanies idea that I think I mentioned a little bit ago here, this idea where like we've kind of shifted just our priorities in life, where work for a lot of people used to be the top of the list, but I think like that's starting to flip a little bit. And as it like said, control of time and spending time with family and friends and just like living a little bit more, I think has become a really top priority for a lot of folks. So that's where like to me the conversation has changed immensely, where I think it's such a it's such a focus area for people, and we're seeing people change jobs to find more meaning, find more career growth. But also a lot of the research that I've seen also talks about like people who are looking for better work-life balance and people who are looking for an opportunity to work in a place where you can do really good work, but where you can also sign off at the end of the day and let it go and then come back to it tomorrow. So that's really where like I think the massive change we've seen on like the individual level, and as we were just talking about with organizations, like we're starting to at least see an understanding and an awareness that well-being and wellness and burnout are obviously huge, impactful, and important issues to be thinking about. But I think there's a pretty important next big step that organizations need to take to really address the root of the problem. So like looking at the culture that exists and the norms and expectations within the culture versus just kind of slapping some band-aids or like just like trying to I don't know, have like approach only the symptoms of the problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's going to be a process, but it's moving in the right direction at least. And I have
Mhm.
a this is a really good question. I've thought about this from the audience. So I know it's a little bit longer, but I'll kind of speed through it. But there's some places that give unlimited vacation days, even with a fixed vacation schedule. I find it less stressful to just work, as the stress of returning is unbelievable. It will take days to go through emails alone. So, do you have any recommendations with like a company that has unlimited vacation days? Because I know there's kind of a silent pressure with that to not take vacation days if your coworkers aren't. And it's very competitive. So, can you talk about that and what recommendations you have with that type of situation, which is common in companies?
So I've worked in a company that has both unlimited PTO and a fixed regular kind of PTO. Personally, I actually, yeah, for some of the reasons outlined there, don't love an unlimited PTO world, just because, yeah, it puts the onus really on the individual, and actually a lot of times can vary quite a bit from like team to team or department to department based on your leadership. So it sets a lot of like really tough to navigate implicit expectations around taking time off. So as a personal sense, I like a more of a fixed PTO model, since a lot of the research actually shows that with an unlimited PTO model, people actually end up taking less time off than in a fixed PTO model. That said, if you are in an unlimited PTO model, like the way I like to try and think about it is like, can you take an hour a day to at least kind of find some rest and find some recharge time? Can you find maybe 2 days a month to kind of in a row take some time to recharge and rest? And then ideally take at least 1, maybe 2 weeks off in the year, like at absolute minimum, like full weeks, essentially, within the year to allow yourself kind of that longer standing recharge time. Um, as far as coming back to a mountain of email, I think unfortunately that is just kind of one of the realities, but it's really, really important to kind of set the expectation that you become unreachable when you're on vacation and do the legwork up front to make sure your managers or your team members can pick things up for you, ideally leaving them with as little as possible to kind of keep afloat, but knowing that like you'll return that favor for them, so everyone's able to take that time off is really important. Because if you're taking time off but you're on the whole time, even just checking in, even if you're not responding to things, like it just completely depreciates the value of taking that time off or taking that trip. It's no fun to be sitting on a beach and answering email. So yeah, that's what I'd say to that one.
Yeah, I completely agree. If you're on vacation, you should be on vacation, 100%.
Yeah.
And I love this. We got a lot of questions coming in. This is one I've thought about. Can you be a changer in an organization? So, what recommendations do you have for employees if they are burnout, but it's normalized in the organization that you just keep on going? Do you leave, or do you speak up and try to advocate to make the change?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think like if you're already burned out, like the last thing you probably want to do is like, okay, let's like I'm gonna go spearhead an effort to try and change the entire company and culture. Like I think there's like some ways you can kind of poke at that to see if it's even a possibility. But yeah, if I were you, like that is definitely a time to think about like that maybe is not exactly the right organization for you. And frankly, like when like I interviewed, so I started my current job 2 years ago, and when I was interviewing for that job, and I recommend for everyone interviewing for jobs, like really take time to interview them before you accept a job. So like if you get offered a job, like go back and like ask like, hey, can I talk to the hiring manager and ask some questions that I have, and like really probe and poke into understanding like their kind of ability to provide like a good workplace for you. So I always recommend like don't ask like the basic simple question of like, hey, how's the work-life balance at XYZ company? Really like ask the probing questions like, what happens if this random request comes in out of left field? Like, how do we handle that? Are people typically like responding to email on vacations or like at night? And really probe into some of those questions to understand like what are the true culture elements of the company and like what are the expectations looking like there. So that's if the company is just like not going to be in a place where you think there's going to be any motion. We're like at my company, like what I've done within our marketing department is I actually, because I know that there's a huge appetite to get this right and do the hard work to get us there. I actually lead a committee of 20 people in our marketing department. It's our hybrid work design committee. So we have actually done a lot of like surveying and focus groups within our department to codify and actually communicate what the norms are. So all of these things that talk about like your success is measured on the outcomes you produce, not the number of hours you work. You can go on a walk in the middle of the day. You should take time off to recharge after like a big project where you've kind of sprinted for a couple of weeks, essentially. So instead of making those really kind of hard to navigate, weird implicit understandings and expectations, we've actually written it, communicated it to the whole team, and said, this is like our playbook that we've all agreed to exist in. And doing that work and continuing to iterate and trying to get it right. So that's where like, I mean, that's hugely extra credit, but since it's a passion area of mine, there's an altruistic and a very selfish personal benefit in this is like I get a really strong say in terms of like what our workplace and what the culture that I work in look like.
Yeah, that's incredible. So that anyone in the audience has an opportunity to do that. It's great. This is another one that from the chat. What books and podcasts do you recommend to learn more about burnout and to equip you with a little more knowledge. I know you mentioned that you went through kind of a series of learning, kind of self-taught education on it. Can you share anything about some specific podcasts and books that you went through?
Yeah, so I mean, I recommend, I said the blue zones a lot, which is just like it's great research just on like how the longest lived and happiest people have, like the common traits that they share. So that's kind of a general book. I'm a huge fan of Anne Helen Peterson, who we actually featured in Oregon Quarterly and got her master's degree at the U of O, who wrote a great book, kind of more on the history side of like how did work get to be the way that it is today, essentially. And she writes a great newsletter as well that really dives into a lot of issues. She just wrote a great piece actually recently about kind of this idea of like, I don't know, the idea that like one job has turned into like three jobs for a lot of people, and like this kind of ballooning effect that has happened here lately. So I really like her work a lot. And then there's a gentleman named John or Jonathan. I'll have to find the last name. It's like M-A-L Malesnik or something like that. I believe he's a professor at UC Berkeley, I want to say, and has written a lot of great work on really thinking about how we get out of this burnout epidemic, if you will. And then finally, Jennifer Moss has written a great book on, also called The Burnout Epidemic, that really attacks this book or attacks this issue in the right way. That I think is really beneficial.
Yeah, those are great. Thank you, Grant. And those are kind of things you can equip people in the audience, and then they can bring it to their management and say like, this is something I've been thinking about and it's important to me. Another question from the chat. I know you talked about this, but I want to go a little bit deeper, but how can management and the company prioritize well-being for employees beyond those surface level ideas that you talked about, like gym memberships, et cetera? Like, what are those like specific things they can kind of do?
Yeah, so again, it all goes back to like just kind of the cultural norms that exist in the company. And like it takes so many different shapes. So I guess one example is like, I don't know, in like company meetings or in team meetings, like if the people who are being kind of put up on a pedestal and like rewarded for working through the weekend all the time and working late nights and blood, sweat, and tears all the time, if like that kind of terminology exists, that's kind of, it's signaling to people that, hey, like you have to work weekends and you have to work nights and long hours to be seen as a success and kind of put up on that pedestal. So that's one example. I mean, time off and is a huge example as well. So if like you see that your management and your managers and bosses are always responding to email when you know that they're marked off on PTO, that's a really difficult norm to know how to navigate. And I know something that was really tough for me early in my career where I saw that happening. So it signaled to me, even though I was never told explicitly, that I had to be monitoring my email. And if something that I deemed urgent enough came up, then I had to basically act on it, even if I was doing whatever I was doing on vacation. So that's probably another area. Yeah, just really anything that like makes it really hard for employees to navigate like what is expected, I think is important to note there. So yeah, I think, yeah, there's a whole lot in that capacity, but those are just like a few examples of just like where employees are signaling like what they're seeing from their management in terms of like what makes you successful in the company and makes it hard to follow.
Yeah, those are great tips. I mean, I know personally, before I started Intel, I was interviewing some companies and I asked them about work-life balance, and just hearing the reactions and the tones, can be pretty eye-opening. So I think it's really important to do that research. This is a good one. We haven't really touched on this. Have you seen good examples of gender equity in regards to burnout? Like, is it different? Have you seen anything like that? Is there anything that you've thought about in that regard?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting. So I was just, we're actually in process of writing at my company at Qualtrics, we're writing a long paper on what we're calling like how to create a culture of belonging. So it hasn't been published yet, but so I've been partnering a lot with the DEI professionals at our company, organizational psychologists to really codify this idea that well-being and DEI issues are, I mean, thought of as separately a lot of times, but they are so deeply interconnected. And basically to the point where like you can't truly like have a culture of well-being if DEI is lagging and vice versa. So I think it's really important to like understand like and work in these two issues together, where if women don't have the same opportunities as men, as people of color don't have the same opportunities, or are having microaggressions that they're dealing with within the workplace, of course there's no way that they're going to feel well and be able to like really put their full self forward. So like, yes, I mean, DEI and well-being are two just like very deeply interconnected issues that are honestly probably in a similar sort of work stream to help kind of like root out and at the cultural level as well.
No, those are really good points. Because it all goes in hand in hand and see what the company values overall. I know we talked about this a little bit, but I want to kind of dive deeper into your personal experiences over your career. Were you ever personally worried about backlash from a manager when you told them, "Hey, like I'm getting burnt out," and faced any type of issues with that with managers, severed relationships, fear of getting fired, anything like that? Can you dive a little bit deeper in those personal stories, please?
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So it's I think every manager is different, every employee is different in this case. So it's hard to have like a true like one size fits all probably response to this. But as we were talking about, like I think we've reached this moment where like the idea and understanding around burnout is pretty well known. I think of course like managers don't want to lose people. Like I think so many staffs are already so thin as it is. So if they're not taken care of and like looking after these issues, there's a real threat of you leaving or kind of the attrition, unwanted attrition in their teams. So whether you want to use the word burnout, like, hey, I'm approaching burnout or not, or just say like this level of like work is not sustainable. Um, I think those are all kind of like language codes that you could probably use to help kind of go into this conversation. But yeah, I mean, I think long story short, at the end of the day, like I would hope that I would hope you don't feel that, because if you're producing high quality work on the goals that you've really talked through and aligned on between employee and manager, then if you're completing those effectively, like that's how your success should be defined, not how many hours or how many things you're taking on necessarily. So yeah, that's usually kind of where I would leave that question. And that said, if you're in a situation where like your success is fully defined on how many hours you work, and if you have the green light on lit up next to your name all the time, and there's a lot of companies that have shifted into a pretty heavy like surveillance culture of like making sure like people are on at their computers all the time, that's a dicey, really hard workplace to navigate and be in. So if I mean it's some place I wouldn't want to be. So if you have the flexibility or desire to look elsewhere like that, yeah, that could be a good opportunity at that point.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not like a one size fits all for everybody, and it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. I think this is a more of a personal question where when you get to that point of burnout, there's kind of that two roads you can kind of open up. You can either keep pushing forward, like I get further, I get more motivation to keep going, or you just kind of say, I don't really care about this job that much. I know personally this is a little unrelated, but like playing basketball, when coaches said you get tired, you keep going, but that may not be really great to associate with work and as you get older. So can you talk about that kind of crossroad when you get to that point, and what avenue to choose, or if there's a third avenue instead?
Well, I think as the road out of burnout, if like you're in that space already, like figuring out like how do you downsize like what you're taking on, and just like the pressure you're putting on yourself, like start very, very small, start with like one thing only. I think like you can't boil the ocean all at once. So I think that's a really important point to note. I think the other like connected topic to this is just like, to me, like understanding the different kind of speeds of work. Like I know actually in the next couple of weeks, like I have a pretty big project in my full-time job that I'm working on. So I'm in kind of what I would consider like a sprint speed right now. Being in a sprint speed is something that I kind of have an understanding with myself that I'm going to be in like 2 to 4 times a year for a very limited amount of time. And then I'll kind of go back to what I would consider my sustainable speed, where like I know I can kind of perform and produce day after day at that speed. If I were to stay at sprint speed all the time, like at some point, like Max, your basketball analogy, like sure, I can push like a little bit further, but you can't stay at that for the whole game. Like I can maybe finish like the last few minutes of the quarter, but I'm going to be dead for the 3 quarters after that or something like that. So I think like understanding those speeds of work is really helpful. And then when you need to really go slow, and I mean, there are and hopefully are various lulls for even a couple days that exist, like be okay with yourself if like you have those lulls where it's like, okay, I'm gonna, like I work in a flexible space, like I can take an afternoon off to go on a walk, or it's a nice day I can go on a bike ride or something. And taking those 3 hours off maybe in the afternoon to go on a bike ride recharges me enough where like I'm able to propel a little bit further. So yeah, I think just like leaning into those, like, and understanding those different speeds, I think can be really helpful to understand like what's the right path there.
Yeah, that's great advice. And yeah, you hope that there's hills and valleys, at every work place, and you have a little bit of break in there. We have time for maybe like 2 more quick questions. So if anyone in the audience wants to come in with a quick question, please put it in. This one is, now with COVID ending, there's people now going back to work. So can you talk about how, commute is also pretty draining, and that can lead to burnout? I mean, I don't know about how everyone in the audience, how far they are from work, but if you're driving an hour away there and back every day, that's draining. So can you talk about how that contributes as well?
Yeah. Well, hopefully COVID is ending. It feels like we're still kind of in the peaks and valleys of that too. But no, that question is really important. And yeah, I mean, personally, I have a 3-hour round trip commute if I commute into the office, which I haven't done too much in the last couple of years. But yeah, I think figuring out like how can you use that commute time to just take a step back and like have that like psychological break, I think is really important. To, I don't know, whether it be listen to music or zone out, or like, I don't know, listen to a podcast about something that's like personally interesting to you, to allow it to kind of be recharge time. If you're like me and my commute would be like public transit, so I wouldn't actually be driving, like just the ability to sit and zone out and use that psychological break to, as we were saying, have that end of day ritual to be able to signal to your brain that the workday is done, and not necessarily always use that for just more working time. So yeah, commutes are what commutes are. I think just figuring out where you can kind of bring some interest and personal joy to what is not the most exciting activity.
Yeah, I completely agree. I know when I'm going to be up at Intel, I'm trying to do a 11-minute commute, so I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible.
That sounds nice.
Yeah. Try to figure it out. I think we went through all the different questions, and it's almost that time. So I want to wrap up a little bit and just say, thank you so much, Grant, on behalf of the Portland Ducks alumni chapter and the UO Alumni Association. I personally appreciate your willingness to share your story, your expertise with us, especially for those that are looking to take control over their relationship with work. And I personally, struggle with that as well, and find that type of balance between living and working. We're going to share the link to the chat box to Grant's personal website, where you can find even more helpful information where he's written about this topic, including blogs and newsletters. And you can also subscribe to Grant, which I definitely recommend. And thank you again for tackling this important subject that's kind of taboo and wasn't really a big thing maybe 10 years ago. And it's really great that it's becoming more of a household topic. So I really appreciate it, and keep up the great work. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in, especially during lunchtime. And we'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with the recording of Grant's webinar and a short survey to help us, if you don't mind to fill it out, to help us plan like future events, and any type of feedback is really appreciated. And if you're looking ways to get involved with the Alumni Association, check out their website. We're going to pop the link in the chat box, excuse me. And there you'll find if you want to get involved in any type of upcoming events and learn more about the alumni chapters and affinity groups. And with that, I just want to say thank you everyone for coming, and stay safe, stay healthy, and go Ducks. Awesome. Thank you, Grant. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.